Stand by. Good morning and welcome to this special ITV news programme with all the latest on the war in Ukraine. Here are the main developments we're waking up to this morning. There seems to be a slight pause in the Russian advance, but attacks continue against the towns and cities of Ukraine, claiming more lives and leaving more destruction, like here to the north of Kiev. With extraordinary bravery, the people of Ukraine continue to defy the invasion, unarmed and demonstrating against their Russian occupiers. President Putin has threatened that a no-fly zone over Ukraine would be treated like a declaration of war. Visa and MasterCard have become the latest big companies to pull out of Russia as sanctions continue to tighten. President Zelensky has again appealed to the US for more assistance, addressing members of Congress and talking to President Biden. At least 1.3 million Ukrainians have now fled their country. We'll be live in Poland, where more than 600,000 have sought refuge. And across the world, like here in Israel, people have been marching in protest against Russia's war. Good morning and welcome to a special ITV news programme on day 11 of the war in Ukraine, where attacks have continued against towns and cities. In an address to his people, Ukraine's President Zelensky has told them not to retreat, and with that extraordinary bravery, there have been demonstrations against Russian invaders. Russia's financial system has suffered another major blow overnight as Visa and MasterCard suspended operations in response to the invasion of Ukraine. This is the scene in Kiev this morning after a relatively quiet night in the capital. But if it seems to the watching world like there is a slight pause in the Russian advance, that will be of no comfort to Ukrainians living in cities under attack. With a roundup of all the latest developments so far, here is Sangeeta Lal.
The familiar rhythm of bombing in Irpin. This suburb of Kiev has seen a steady barrage of artillery and a never-ending stream of people trying to escape. Its main bridge brought down by Ukrainians trying to prevent Russian forces entering the capital, as people here refuse to surrender the city. The fight, though, is exhausting. The planes were flying and I just covered my ears. It was so beautiful and now it's destroyed, she says. What are they trying to achieve? To bring us to our knees? As thousands flee, others prepare to fight. Ukraine's military released this video claiming to have shot down a Russian helicopter. 11 days into this war, as their country turns to rubble, they remain defiant. President Putin, though, warns he will not back down. If they continue to do what they are doing, they are calling into question the future of Ukrainian statehood. And if this happens, it will be entirely on their conscience. Exhausted and trying to escape. Southern routes out of Mariupol, though, are destroyed as ceasefires are not held. Across the world, though, there is continued support. People determined to show they stand together with Ukraine. Sangeeta Lal, ITV News.
Well, let's now take a closer look at the situation across Ukraine as the war enters its 11th day. In Mariupol in the south, the failed ceasefire leaves the situation there unchanged. The city is surrounded and under bombardment, but still under Ukraine's control. Elsewhere in the south, the Russian occupation now stretches up, and attacks have continued on Mykolaiv, where Ukrainian forces have been repelling several assaults. And in Odessa, people still living there are preparing for the prospect of a naval attack on the city. In the north, the Russians have opened a new corridor from areas they control in the east towards the capital, Kiev. Let's take you live to the capital now and join our Europe editor, James Mates. Kiev is still under Ukrainian control 11 days into this invasion.
Very much so, yeah. I mean, very little has changed in the centre of the city. And we're hearing this morning there's obviously a significant battle going on, as Sangeeta was suggesting, in Irpin, which is just up here to the northwest. A rumble of artillery and explosions. But basically, the front line in Kiev hasn't moved in the last 11 days. That was where the first attacks were made, and they haven't got much further. It's extraordinary being here in that 8 days ago we were threatened by this huge convoy heading for the heart of the city, which then stopped and hasn't moved since. And having all had to wonder how long we could stay here, whether if we stayed we'd ever get out, whether an encirclement was due, suddenly the war froze more or less in aspic, and this, we see the satellite pictures of this convoy sitting on the outside of town, and fundamentally in the centre of the city nothing has changed.
And James, what kind of night has it been?
Oh, it's pretty quiet. I mean, the nights are frankly quieter now than they were at the beginning of the war. There's sirens, there are explosions, but they're in the distance. We've had one very serious attack in the centre of when they tried to attack the television tower and ended up hitting the Holocaust memorial at Babin Yar. But apart from that, it's I mean, it's noisy, but otherwise bearable.
And what is your assessment of what may or may not have happened to that convoy, a 40-mile long convoy? Reports earlier this week that it had stalled, that they'd run out of fuel, that they'd run out of food. What's your assessment?
Well, they have clearly got stuck in one of the world's biggest traffic jams. Now, whether that's because there were attacks at the head of the convoy that have blocked the road, we will find out as the days and weeks go by, I'm sure. But essentially, they're nose to tail on that road, unable to move. The road is extraordinary on either side of it is mud and swamp, and so any movement off the road, any attempt to try and get round any blockages are not possible there. But I mean, it is representative of the tremendous logistical and supply problems that the Russians have run into since this war began. The Ukrainians have focused a lot of their attacks on those supply convoys, soft targets behind the tanks, behind the front line. They've gone in after them. We see video after video of these long lines of trucks and fuel trucks and anti-aircraft weapons and stuff that follow on behind the tanks, all destroyed or captured, and it is seriously adding to the Russian inability to prosecute this war, because I mean, logistics is everything in wartime, as any general will tell you.
Of course. We've heard once again President Zelensky not only rallying his troops but rallying his country, and yet again, from what we've seen in the last 24 hours, people in Ukraine have responded to that call.
Oh, yeah, I mean, huge numbers of volunteers, thousands and thousands of volunteers turning up for territorial guard duty. But more to the point, I mean, morale. I mean, Napoleon said that victory in war was sort of 1/3 numbers and equipment, 2/3 morale, and that, I think, explains a very great deal of why the Ukrainians are performing so very much better than anyone thought possible. Led by Zelensky and his daily, sometimes multiple times a day, addresses to them. The information war has been won hands down so far by the Ukrainians. Their morale is high. If anything, they're going on the offensive in various fronts. They are worried, obviously, about what's going to happen in Odessa, this beautiful city on the Black Sea, which the Russians are moving towards it. There's a danger of an amphibious landing. But on Mykolaiv, as was mentioned in the report there, on the approaches to Odessa seems to be holding out. Mariupol, a tremendous tragedy developing there, 400,000 people besieged. I think that may become one of the most powerful images of the war, is the fate of Mariupol.
James Mates, for now, thank you very much for joining us. I'm joined in the studio all morning by our correspondent, Robert Moore, just picking up on a couple of points there that James was making. In terms of what we've seen from President Zelensky, do you think that President Putin has underestimated what sort of leader he would be in terms of managing to kind of get this country, even in the streets where Russian soldiers are walking towards people, these Ukrainians walking towards that clear and present danger?
Good morning. Yes, I think at every stage of this, President Putin appears to have severely miscalculated the resilience of the Ukrainian resistance, underestimated and miscalculated President Zelensky's character and how he would emerge, not as just as the old comedian, but then as a wartime president. I mean, how improbable a journey is that for President Zelensky? And I think he's underestimated some of the logistical challenges as well. Just as James was reporting, the central Ukrainian strategy appears to be to attack the supply convoys at the Russian rear. That is proving extremely problematic, while we've seen that what James accurately described as the world's longest traffic jam. And we're seeing now Russia having to revert to the old military tactics it used in Grozny and in other wars that Putin has prosecuted, namely siege warfare, and using bombardment as an unbelievably crude kind of military strategy. And so that is the tragedy we're seeing unfold in Mariupol, and that's why there is so much concern about siege warfare going forward, not just Odessa, but obviously ultimately Kiev itself. Yeah,
which we've seen in other parts of the world, and now we're seeing it in Ukraine. Robert, for now, thank you very much. We can now join Vasyl Salishuk, who is the foreign policy advisor to the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you very much for joining us, Vasyl, this morning. You personally took what must have been a very difficult decision to leave the capital, Kiev. Tell us a bit about why you reached that decision.
First of all, thank you for having me. Yes, you're right. We left Kiev with my family. We didn't feel safe. On the first day when we've heard at 5 o'clock in the morning bombardment of suburbs of Kiev, first we decided to stay and help some journalists to report what's going on. But then we realized that their strategy would be to encircle Kiev and to close the entrances and exits, and at some point the food supply and medicine supply and water and electricity and communication could be a problem. So we decided to leave, but at the same time we didn't decide to leave the country. We decided to stay in Ukraine. I'm here in the western part of Ukraine, close to the Hungarian border, and I have some places to stay abroad, but psychologically, it's extremely difficult to accept that you can't stay in your country anymore, that you have to leave your home. So we stay here and we'll try to stay as much as possible.
How can you help those who have either decided to stay in the likes of the capital or in Mariupol, or had no choice but to stay? They are now facing this situation where they are either at threat of attack or are being attacked, or as we've been hearing in Mariupol, where this siege mentality is now becoming real, isn't it? You know, people are cut off from supplies in the rest of the world.
Yes, one of the international humanitarian organizations today announced that there is a proper humanitarian crisis in Mariupol because the city is encircled and people can't leave and the shellings are going on. And a couple of days already, there have been negotiations between Russian troops, Ukrainian government, with the mediators from Red Cross and United Nations to create green corridors to allow people to leave from Mariupol, but also from other cities like Berdyansk, Volnovakha, Kherson, because the situation on the ground is extremely, extremely difficult. Some people are sitting without electricity, light, water, more than 7 days, more than a week in the cellar with small kids, with small children. And it's just heartbreaking. But so first, Russians agreed to create those green corridors, but then they blocked it. And I saw today with my eyes of how people were first ready to go, were trying to get into the buses, but then later on, Ukrainian government representative said, I'm sorry, we don't have the guarantees that shelling is not going to happen, so we should stay and wait for another opportunity. So evacuation is one of the biggest issues, but also humanitarian aid like help with food, water, with medicine is another issue that people need.
Do you think that second opportunity will come? Do you think the Russians will adhere to those terms and conditions of that corridor?
There is a huge international pressure now on Russians to create those green corridors, because actually it is a war crime to ban civilians to leave military war zones during the humanitarian crises. So I do hope, because it's an issue for, at the moment, hundreds of thousands of peaceful Ukrainians in those cities.
Vasyl Salishuk, thank you very much for joining us this morning as we try to work out what may or may not happen next in Ukraine. Thank you. Well, every day since the invasion, tens of thousands of Ukrainians take the desperately difficult decision to leave and seek safety in neighbouring countries. So far, Poland has taken the most. Nick Dixon joins me now from Przemysl, close to the Polish-Ukrainian border. Nick, another scene of this rapid response to this great need of those people who have escaped from Ukraine.
Yes, Poland certainly taking the brunt of this at the moment. The authorities saying that as of yesterday, upwards of 800,000 refugees have made their way across the border into Poland, many of them ending up in places like this. Now, this technically is what they're calling a refugee processing centre, but in real terms, it is a retail car park, a huge one as well, which is now dominated by volunteers and refugees. If you just take a look over to my right, that's a disused indoor shopping centre there. Now, there are at any one time well over 1,000 people in there sleeping, resting, mothers and children who have just come off the buses, getting some warmth and going in there. There's a chemist in there, volunteers are helping them as much as possible. An awful lot of people are sleeping there. We can't go in this morning just to respect their privacy, but they set up stalls as well. You can see there's helplines on a sort of makeshift board here. People can come off the bus and get water. They can get clothing, hats, gloves, food for their children, really anything they need immediately when they're getting off the buses. There's a lot of people queuing up just over here, over my shoulder. These people are waiting to get SIM cards from one of the mobile phone networks, because obviously they're arriving in the country and for the most part their phones won't be working, so they're handing out SIM cards to these people. Buses have been arriving, really, we've been here about an hour and a half this morning, and we've seen maybe a dozen buses arriving here. They usually pull up here, people will just filter off. Anywhere between 50 to 200 people inside these buses coming directly from the border. Just follow me over here. We've been here reporting on this for well over a week now. Initially when we arrived here, this processing centre was really just a couple of these kind of market stalls with water, a little soup kitchen, but it's expanded so much now because of this huge humanitarian crisis. Obviously it's still here, you can see there are people helping and they're dropping off donations as well. Up at the top you'll see an awful lot of clothing for people, warm blankets. People are driving along to this area and they're dropping off any extra clothes that they have lying around, and they're all gratefully received here. But you do have to wonder how long this continue. The Polish government have said that they certainly don't want a situation where they have refugee camps all over the country at the moment. They're still hopeful that many people coming in are fortunate enough that they do have friends, relatives or family that they can contact and move on to see either in this country or the neighbouring countries. But of course many others won't be in that situation, and they are having to go to hotels or hostels, apartments, places like this. But as I say, you do wonder how on earth Poland will cope with these ever increasing numbers of people coming across the border.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick Dixon, thank you very much. That little girl there waving to your camera with such a beautiful smile in these horrendous situations and conditions. Thank you for that, Nick. Look, day after day we are hearing heartbreaking stories about families separated, lives and livelihoods abandoned, and the terrifying need to escape. From one refugee story to another, let's join our correspondent Romy Weeks, who is now in Lviv in western Ukraine, where many people find themselves after escaping from fighting elsewhere. Romy, tell us exactly where you are today and what you are hearing and seeing.
Well, Nina, I'm standing outside the main train station just behind me here in Lviv, and the UN is saying This weekend, the number of people trying to flee Ukraine is expected to reach 1.5 million.
It's really corruption country, really. The
This
bus
is what
was
it
free,
looks like.
But today it's not free.
Okay,
but
where
we are
have you come
refugee.
from and where are you trying to go?
I'm from Kiev and I'm trying to go to Polsha from Lviv,
Yeah.
and it's really corruption country. Really,
you can't-
this bus was free, and today it's not free
Yeah.
for refugee.
Yeah, it's very hard.
Yeah, we have to say it because we have to change something.
Yeah.
I want to change because it's my country, it's Ukraine. I want to live there, and people have to change, really.
Okay,
Has changed.
thank you. So many stories of people trying to get to Poland, trying to find a place to stay here in Lviv. The scale of what is happening here is really extraordinary. There are thousands upon thousands of people arriving at the train station. It is far too busy for people to enter. The doors are shut. If you can see over there in the distance, you can see the platform, people trying to get on the trains. There are buses arriving here. There are trams arriving here. People are queuing to get on them. There is a massive area set up over here with tents where people are trying to find warmth and food for their children. As you can see, the very young are arriving, the very old are arriving. People are bringing whatever they can carry on their backs. People are bringing their pets. There's a family with a dog over here. I've just spoken to the Kharkova family who have come from near Odessa. It's taken them a day on a train to get here. They've come, here's another very young child. They've come with their 5 children. They were trying to feed them on a bench by the station entrance. They're trying to get to Poland. They have no idea how they're going to make it, how they're going to make that journey. I'm going to just walk over here. I want to speak to this group of young people who have all come from Kiev. Hello. I know you've all just met on the train. You've decided to travel together. You've decided to help each other. Just tell me why you decided to leave and where you're hoping to go to.
All day in Kiev, it's
like Kiev is in a disaster situation right now. We don't have jobs, we don't have income, we don't have enough food sometimes, and we're just basically forced to leave. And even as foreigners, we tried to stay to the very last, but unfortunately the situation is getting disastrous.
And I know you're from Mongolia. Do you know what you're going to do next, where you're going to go?
Actually, I applied to get a green card in Ukraine, but right before I got it, the whole thing started. So I think I'm gonna go to Poland now and wait for a little bit there, and if I can, I'll come back. If I can't, I'll stay in Poland for a while, maybe.
And you're from Ukraine. How do you feel about what's happening to your country when you see the scale of what's happening here?
all days in Kiev, it's really sad, and my heart and mine, it's I have more pain, but I pray about Ukraine. I really believe in Ukraine. So it's
And what are your emotions too as you leave? It must be very difficult to say goodbye to your friends, to your home, to your family.
All my friends leaves their home and go somewhere and я уже забыла.
It's taken a toll on us. We're all devastated. We still want to stay in Ukraine if possible, but unfortunately, it's the choice we had to make. And thinking that some kids that were playing outside, going to school or kindergarten just a month ago, they are forced to now hide in bomb shelters, just take their toys with them because it reminds them of their home. It's heartbreaking to see.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me, and really good luck with the rest of your journey. I don't know if you can see down here, but you see there are thousands more people arriving all the time. So people trying to leave Lviv, people trying to get on to other countries, but also people arriving and trying to find a place to stay here.
Yeah, absolutely. Romilly, for now, thank you very much. Incredible to see there so very many people, so very many queues, and yet no sign of panic, but clearly lots of people who are broken by how everything has changed in Ukraine so dramatically just over the past week and a half. Well, while the rest of the world is following events in Ukraine closely and, of course, with horror, it is a very different story in Russia. President Putin has cracked down mercilessly on the country's independent media. Just this week, he moved against some of the last TV and radio channels broadcasting critical views. It means Russians are getting an increasingly limited view of what is really going on. One of those stations, TV Rain, was forced out of action. On March the 3rd, Katya Kotrikadze was one of their reporters specialising in foreign news. She got out of Russia before the closure and is now outside of the country. Katya, take us through, first of all, please, if you will. Thank you for joining us. Why did you decide you had to leave Russia?
It was impossible to stay there. It was a situation when we understood that it was a terrible danger for all of us, for all the people who used to work for the independent television station, also for our colleagues from different, independent media outlets left. Only few were left, actually. We've got the signals about the threat that we were facing, me personally, my husband, who is an editor-in-chief, my colleagues. Also, I've got the messages and threats from terrible people saying that they were coming for me, and so on and so forth. And we knew that the law would be approved in Russia. The law, which was approved actually after we left, about the fakes on military situation. It means that if you say that the war is a war, if you name things, if you say that Russia invaded a neighboring country, if you say that Vladimir Putin is responsible, if you say anything close to that, they may declare you as a fake media, and they may put you into jail for 15 years. For extremism. And they're now, developing this new laws, new actions against the free journalists, against the independent people, against the freedom of speech. And I would say, I don't know what is left actually in Russia, what is left to do. Everything that could have been done by Vladimir Putin is done. The repressions level is just terrible. I would say that everything that was left there, every single sign of democracy is destroyed. There is nothing left in the country.
Such a bleak assessment of what's going on. Katya, I'm joined in our studio in London by our correspondent, Robert Moore. I know he's got a question for you, if you will, Robert.
Katya, we salute your journalism over recent years, as we do from those at Echo Moskvy and other independent journalistic outlets, and we understand that it's now, almost impossible to report. I wonder what your assessment is about whether Russians are still able to get alternative narratives to the Kremlin's. Are they able to listen to the Russian service of the BBC? Is there talk about getting online in any capacity that gives them the alternative to what's happening in Ukraine? In other words, can they understand the reality of the Russian action, the war in Ukraine?
People who still speak English, for example, they always may use internet, which is not blocked so far. And also there are a couple of people staying there who try to work independently, who try to put the news on their social media networks and channels, which is also efficient. But for the big audience, for millions of viewers, people who used to watch us, for example, we've had during this war days, starting, I don't remember, 24th of February, every single day we've had 25 million views on YouTube. And it means that there were millions of people who were watching TV Rain, which was a problem for the government. Now, these people are looking for some alternative information online, and they may find it, of course. I mean, there is something there, but, it's not easy for them to get the reliable source and to be with some channels 24/7, just as they were with us. We are thinking about figuring something out. We don't know yet. We don't have any plans so far because we're devastated. We are in an absolutely terrible situation because all of us, we've lost the best job we've had. Our lives are ruined. Everything has dramatically changed for us. Yeah, you can see the last broadcast of TV Rain. We were saying goodbye to each other, and it was terrible. But there is still a huge problem of the governmental media, of state media. They were spreading terrible information, terrible propaganda, saying that Ukraine is a threat for Russia, that Ukraine has to be put on the right side of the history, that the time has come to get Ukraine back, blah, 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 and that NATO is threatening Russia. So these people are really, like a lot of people, we don't know how many, because there's no sociology in this country. It's not easy to understand how many people trust Russian state propaganda, but there is a huge amount of people. I'm sure that this is a very big part of Russian society who still trusts this propaganda machine. And I think that the propaganda faces, all Russians know them, they're as responsible as Vladimir Putin and all his officials for what's going on with the country. These people are just, the faces of this disaster and catastrophe.
Aiding and abetting. Katya Kotry-Kazadi, thank you very much for joining us. We're glad you are safe and out of Russia for now. It is just after 7:30. A quick look at the latest developments on the Ukraine conflict. Cities and towns across Ukraine continue to be bombarded, but there seems to be a slight pause in the Russian advance. In the last hour, the UK's Ministry of Defence said the scale and strength of the Ukrainian resistance continues to surprise Russia. Overnight, Visa and MasterCard pulled out of operations in Russia as sanctions continue to tighten. Our US correspondent Emma Murphy is standing by in Washington. Emma, President Biden and President Zelensky have spoken, one desperate for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, the other one desperate not to go down that route. What came of that talk between the two of them?
Yeah, they come from very different positions on this, and there was no real agreement. However, I think the message that we're getting from the White House is that the US is doing everything it can to try and support as much as possible without actually going anywhere near that no-fly zone issue. Now, one of the issues that President Zelensky raised yesterday with the president and also with the members of Congress that he spoke to on a Zoom call during the day was the fact that if he can't control the air, he can't protect the streets, and that one way or the other they are going to have to try and help him deal with this situation in the air. If they won't put a no-fly zone in, what will they do to try and help him? Now, there have been supplies of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that have gone in over the past few weeks. 14 flights have actually gone in the last few days, full of defensive weaponry. But one of the things he asked for was, if you won't give us that no-fly zone, give us some planes, because a lot of the Ukrainian planes were damaged in the first few days of the battle. And one of the compromises that's being negotiated at the moment is whether or not the Ukrainians could be given some Russian-made fighter jets that they know how to fly that are currently in Poland. Now, of course, this isn't as simple as it might sound. It's not a matter of literally handing over the keys, because that would leave Poland very vulnerable, and they obviously don't want to be in that position. So what would need to happen was that the MiGs that are in Poland that the Ukrainians know how to fly would need to be given to them. At the next point, the Americans or others would have to provide the Polish with F-16s. Now, the problem with that is that there's a supply chain problem. There aren't enough to really go round and be handed out in that way. And the concern for America is that if they hand out their next delivery of F-16s, it means that they won't be going to Taiwan, which has got the issue with China. So you get a feeling of just how complicated the geopolitics is here. And then you throw in a global supply chain issue and things get incredibly difficult. But there is a lot of work underway to try and resolve this issue of how to give the Ukrainians some level of air dominance at the moment. One of the other things that the two presidents discussed last night was this whole issue of Visa and MasterCard. President Zelensky had really pushed for that during the day, and late on last night came the confirmation that Visa and MasterCard were suspending their operations in Russia. It basically means that if you have a Visa or a MasterCard issued in Russia, you won't be able to use it anywhere in the world. And if you try to use a Visa or MasterCard from abroad in Russia, it won't be accepted. It's another attempt to just eat away at Russia's position financially. And of course, the other thing that really was being pushed in that telephone call and the meeting with the congressmen and women yesterday was this issue of American and Western reliance on Russian oil. And President Zelensky once again saying that until that is really addressed, there isn't going to be any great ability to pressure Russia, because they are still getting all those funds. Now, I was just reading the New York Times, and this morning Boris Johnson has written an opinion piece in there, very much stressing this issue of unity in the West, stressing the support for Ukraine, and going back to that issue that just seems so distant now, where this in theory all started, or at least this is where Russia said it all started, which was Ukraine's membership of NATO. And the Prime Minister says that, of course, that was never an issue, really, that NATO was never going to accept Ukraine, and there's no sign of that anytime soon. And once again, issuing that plea to President Putin for some form of diplomacy. Now, whether that diplomacy will come, we know there will be more talks in the coming days, but we've seen just how difficult that it has been to even establish those humanitarian corridors and make temporary ceasefires last. So there will be a lot more work going on, more phone bashing over the coming days between all these nations to try and secure some kind of position that takes this away from conflict and closer to diplomacy.
Emma Murphy, thank you very much for all that. Thank you so much. So from Washington to Downing Street, and our political reporter Shihab Khan. Shihab, the Prime Minister now has a 6-point plan to defeat President Putin. Is there anything new in what Boris Johnson is suggesting now?
It is essentially an attempt to codify what has been the current strategy so far, but you're right, it is a 6-point plan. I'll talk you through what each of those 6 points are. It starts with world leaders should work together and mobilise an international humanitarian coalition, and that is help to deal with the ever-growing refugee crisis that you're hearing about and that we're seeing in Ukraine. There's also talk of supporting Ukraine in its self-defence, whether that's done through providing support by providing weapons or other equipment that may be required by the Ukrainian armed forces to defend themselves. There's also talk of ramping up the economic pressure that's on Russia. We're seeing and hearing about more sanctions being discussed. There's already been a big sanction package that's been put through by the UK, the European Union and the US, and there's more discussions about more coming should it be required. Boris Johnson also talks about in this plan of pursuing a diplomatic solution, and that's always been the priority, but to ensure that includes the legitimate government of Ukraine in any discussions. There's also talk about resisting normalising what Russia is doing and not allowing it to become something that we think is an acceptable way to behave. And then lastly, the 6th point is to ramp up the and strengthen the security among NATO allies. That is the one that will most likely cause concern to Russia, but that is the 6-point plan. Boris Johnson will be meeting with his Canadian counterpart, Justin Trudeau, and his Dutch counterpart too tomorrow. He'll be discussing those 6 points, and those 6 points are something that he'll be hoping that he can rally Western allies around. He'll also be holding meetings on Tuesday with leaders from the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland and Slovakia. They are 4 nations that have been dealing with the humanitarian crisis more than anyone else simply because of their proximity and closeness to Ukraine. There, that will be an opportunity for Boris Johnson to discuss what the United Kingdom can do. And again, there'll be talk of that 6-point plan, what the strategy is moving forward to try and deal with this, and also the support that the United Kingdom can provide to help countries having to deal with this refugee crisis.
Yeah, a big couple of days coming up in terms of diplomatic efforts for the Prime Minister. One newspaper this morning, the Sunday Mail, has suggested that this is Boris Johnson's Falklands moment. That take has been criticised for being distasteful given the scenes we are seeing coming out of Ukraine.
Absolutely. There's no denying that the political pressure the Prime Minister was under before this crisis with Partygate, and there's been some talk, as you say, of this being that Falklands moment. That's in reference to when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister and the Falklands War went on, and it ended up resulting in her popularity going up. Now, as you say, there's been some criticism of that commentary simply because of what we're witnessing in Ukraine. There are so many people affected by this, so many people's lives at risk. And there is a significant difference between the Falklands War and what is going on in Ukraine. And the biggest one is, of course, that no British troops are currently fighting in Ukraine. That's why there is a big difference. And it is Ukrainians who are at risk here. So the criticism about it being distasteful comes from that. It's the fact that there are so many people's lives who are at risk, so many people's lives who are being turned upside down by this. It's important to note that that commentary hasn't come from Number 10. It's not something that they recognise, but at the moment that even being spoken about, as you say, is being described as quite a distasteful way of looking at the current situation.
Shihab, thank you very much. Thank you. On Friday, the world woke to the news of the Russian attack on a nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine. World leaders united in condemnation, calling the attack horrific and reckless. The Zaporizhzhia plant is the largest in Europe. A fire was contained and radiation levels remained normal, but there was and is concern about the plant being targeted in the first place. Let's speak now to Dr Patricia Lewis, who is a nuclear physicist who leads the International Security Programme at Chatham House. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Look, if President Putin is willing to attack a nuclear plant, how concerned should we be about what else he is willing to do?
Yes, I mean, very concerned is the answer. I mean, there are laws in place to actually prevent a nuclear attack, an attack on a nuclear installation. Under the Geneva Convention, Additional Protocol 1, which was agreed in 1977, there's a natural law in place to prevent this. So just doing that and breaking the law, as he broke the law to actually invade Ukraine in the process, means, I think, that he is prepared to ride roughshod over all of the laws and rules and regulations that we have in place on all of these issues. And we can see from the behaviour that humanitarian concern is not high on his list of priorities.
Given what you've just said, what could he do next then?
Well, he could indeed go and take control of other nuclear power stations in Ukraine. Ukraine has about half of its electricity produced by nuclear power stations. It has several in other parts of the country. So that's one thing that I think is quite likely to do as they take over if they take over more of the country. And he will say it's for due diligence, I think, to make sure that the nuclear installations aren't subject to theft, for example, or potential terrorists going in and taking material. The other possibility, of course, is that they want to have control in order to be able to say later on that, they've discovered that Ukraine was trying to make nuclear weapons or something like that. So we may also be worried about the use of other types of weapons that he might use, as he has used indeed in Salisbury, chemical weapons, for example. So these are all great concerns. He's clearly torn up all the international rulebook.
What doesn't make sense is if we saw another attack on a nuclear power station, he is risking his own people as well as those across the continent of Europe. That doesn't make sense.
Well, to be honest, most of the impact, the radioactive impact from an incident at a nuclear power station would be local. These types of power reactors are not like the old Chernobyl reactors. They're more like the Fukushima reactors. So you would see local devastation, if you like, to the area and to the water supply. But I think that the likelihood of there being a mass radioactive incident for the whole of Europe and for Russia is quite low. So that won't be on his great concern. He just does not care about the people of Ukraine at the moment. So he doesn't care whether he damages them further in this way.
Patricia, given it was a week ago now that President Putin told the world that he put Russia's nuclear deterrent on high alert, how concerned are you about two developments? One, that he says sanctions are akin to a declaration of war, and also the fact that he has said yesterday that a no-fly zone would be a declaration of war.
Indeed, it's very worrying. The nuclear weapons, not deterrent. This is a threat. It's not trying to deter NATO, right? It is a threat to NATO.
Yeah, absolutely. His words.
Weapons, yes, but I think it also means that we shouldn't necessarily repeat what he wants us to. I think that these nuclear weapons that he's threatening us with, there is no movement at the moment that anyone has been able to report on making those nuclear weapons operational in the field. But the fact that he has made this is designed to frighten us. And then he then says, as you say, that these economic sanctions and any no-fly zone would be a declaration of war is clearly, again, designed to frighten us. So he's using nuclear weapons, not in a way to deter, but in a way to threaten directly any further action by NATO to support Ukraine.
Dr. Lewis, we've seen a very unpredictable 11 days so far. What is your prediction for the week ahead?
Well, I always hate to make predictions, particularly about the future. But I think that what we can see is that the rule book, the way in which the international community, to which Russia has agreed, and Russia is party to all of these agreements other than the Cluster Munitions Convention, that he doesn't care about them. He's riding roughshod over them. So we're likely to, I think, to see increasing violence. I think we can see that from what happened in Syria. I think we can see it from what happened in Chechnya and so on. So we're likely to see increasing violence. We're likely to see civilians targeted, and we're likely to see more threats, which, of course, we will have to take very seriously. So it's not looking good. I mean, the idea that the Ukrainians could hold on for this long is extraordinary, and, amazing people, amazing resilience to be able to do that. And we can only support them in every which way we can without making things worse. And I think that's the real difficulty for military planners, for politicians at the moment, is how do you support without actually making things worse, both for Ukraine and for the rest of Europe?
Yeah, indeed. How? Dr. Patricia Lewis, thank you very much for your thoughts. Thank you. While refugees continue to flee across the borders and to safety in Ukraine, there are some people whose vital work keeps them in Ukraine's cities. Doctors and nurses are still treating patients who need treatment and are too sick to be evacuated. Arena Martinchuk is a haematologist at the National Cancer Institute in Kiev, and she joins me now. Thank you very much for talking to us in this incredibly busy and traumatic time. You spend your day at work and your nights in bomb shelters. How are you coping with such a crucial job with so little respite?
Hello, everyone. Yes, it's a disaster and it's terrifying, but we are trying to do our best. We had several patients when the war started, and we couldn't leave them because they need our help, medicine, and our support. So we continued with the treatment, and sometimes even treatment we were forced to do it in the bomb shelter because air raid sirens were loud, and we couldn't wait with some infusion. For example, in these pictures we made stem cell infusion in bomb shelter. But now we are okay, our patients are fine. They need all necessary help and medication, so we're coping with this.
You stayed in the capital. You are continuing to work. Your husband and your 2-year-old daughter have left the city. They fled to Western Ukraine. That separation under these circumstances must be unimaginable to our viewers who are hearing you talk now.
It is difficult. I'm very worried about them. They're worried about me. But we can speak. Thanks, connection is good. We speak every day and support each other. That's what can we do now.
How are your colleagues, Arena?
Actually, almost the whole department of bone marrow transplant stay now here in the National Cancer Institute for doctors and several nurses. So our patients have everything they need at the moment.
Did you ever imagine when you were a medical student that your career would include working through a global pandemic, and whilst that pandemic was ongoing, you would be working in these circumstances, separated from your family, treating people, having complex treatments like a stem cell transplant in a bomb shelter?
Yeah, of course, no. I couldn't imagine even on 20th February, and still the first bomb we heard. So it's really difficult to believe this is a reality even right now.
Is it the case that some parts of the centre you work in have been evacuated? The children's unit has been moved to safety in Poland?
Yeah. All our children department was evacuated because for children it was really hard. It was great pain to see how they should spend in shelter, because adult patients could go up during the day and down at night, but for some of children it was difficult to transfer them up and down. There was a decision to stay them in the basement for the whole day. And it is really a disaster for little children who are sick to stay there.
How much are you using your time away from the hospital to focus in what is happening in other parts of the country, in Mariupol, where we know that people are cut off from basic supplies? You must be worried that, you are okay right now in terms of basic supplies, be them medical or food and water, but that what is happening in Mariupol could come to the capital eventually.
Yeah, of course, we are always in the news, reading them and worrying about them. Our administration creating some plans for these circumstances. So I think we will be okay. I hope so.
And how are you dealing with the anxiety that your patients must be feeling in terms of either being treated in these circumstances or not knowing whether, in many cases we're talking about life-saving treatment that could be interrupted with a moment's notice?
We support our patients. We have psychological support here in the National Cancer Institute, and we are all together trying to calm down them. So it's really difficult because the cancer diagnosis by itself, it's stress, and during such circumstances as war and bombs and all these alarms, it is difficult. But they are good, they're okay.
Well, that is good to hear at the very least. Arena Martinchuk, it's been a real privilege to talk to you, given the circumstances and given the situation you are working through. Thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for your support.
So many stories of bravery, not least from Ukrainians who are demonstrating against their Russian occupiers. Kherson on the Black Sea was the largest city captured by the Russians so far. But its residents have not taken their occupation lying down. They've been demonstrating on the streets, waving the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine and defying the Russians. One of them is Andrew Abbey, who we can speak to now. How do you motivate yourself, given the situation you are in right now, to still say collectively, we are defiant, we are occupied, but we are not going to stand for this?
Hey there from Kherson. It's been difficult to live through the past days. It's been quite difficult to realize that we've been occupied. So I think it was important for us all to demonstrate to the enemy and to our countryfolk as well that we are not broken, we were not subdued, and whatever the Russians are doing, which is they're cutting food supplies, they have blockaded the city, even though they are in here, which I believe is a violation of every known humanitarian protocol during war. It's important for us to show each other that we stand united, that Kherson is not just a few people living down in their bunkers and cellars trying to hide. No, we are a small city, but we are staying united. We are not the cattle to be driven into and massacred. No, we will stand together. And I think yesterday was the first day I saw my father smiling. He's a doctor. He's been seeing the atrocities of the wounded and the dead from day one. And yesterday he was chanting Ukrainian anthem with me and my brother at the city square. And that was a brief moment of some respite, I guess, the moral one. I guess there were around 4, 5, 6,000 people there. It's the largest rally Kherson has witnessed in decades. And that's not an overstatement. I guess it takes a war and a mad dictator to gather as many Khersonians in one place. It felt great. I hope we'll hold a similar rally today. I'm actually just rushing to that rally as we speak, just gathering my stuff. I hope today's picture will be not worse than yesterday's. I hope it will be as peaceful as it was yesterday. So no civilians are shot, because we're getting reports of Russians bringing in riot police from Crimea. I still hope that they just trying to scare us from taking it to the streets, but it won't scare us. It's Ukraine, it's not Russia. We're not afraid of our riot police even.
We of course hope the same if you do take to the streets later today. I'm in the studio in London with our correspondent Robert Moore, and I know he has a question for you as well.
Andre, you're one of the few people we've spoken to who have sort of been eye to eye with those Russian invaders. Do they strike you as young men who are confused and disorientated, who are kind of there without understanding the implications, or are they kind of Putin's foot soldiers, brutal and ruthless and with a full awareness of their kind of situation? How do they strike you, those Russian soldiers in your town?
I guess we saw both kinds all over Ukraine. In Kherson, the ones I saw, the ones I witnessed were looking quite like people who know what they are doing. Probably they are professional soldiers, not just the freshly drafted ones. They are ruthless, they are brutal, they don't hesitate to shoot their guns, to scare people or even to wound people, to disperse the crowd. Yesterday, they were probably humbled by the mass of people flocking through the streets. I'm not sure what will happen today. So far in Kherson, the sheer amount of people shot on sight or died from shellings is probably one of the highest in Ukraine. So they're trying to terrorize us. They're trying to starve us. And personally, I don't see that as just confused young people trying to do what they are told. No, they know perfectly well what they're doing. They're doing the war crime, and they are fully aware of that, I'm sure.
Andrew, if you go out onto the street today, how will you deal with the fact that it could turn very nasty very quickly? You didn't encounter that yesterday, but what went through your mind yesterday when you were putting your life in real danger by being out there?
It's damn terrifying, I say. I mean, I'm a civilian. I've never held a gun in my hand. I don't know how to shoot. But the thing is, well, you do what you've got to do. You're doing it for your country. You're doing it for yourself, just to feel like a dignified human being. This is something you ought to do in order to stay human. You need to take your rights. You need to take your feelings out in the streets, even though there are no armed forces of Ukraine in the city. We need to hold out. I'm scared. and probably so are most of my compatriots right now, but we're still gonna do that right until we can't. And even if we can't do that because they start shooting at us, we'll find other ways. So don't worry, we will not stop resistance. If situation changes, and that scares me again, I guess we'll just need to adapt. I hope I won't be caught in the gunfire.
We hope you won't as well, of course. How frustrating is it that we're showing these pictures of what happened in your city yesterday and what presumably will happen later, but many people, most people, the majority of people in Russia will not be seeing how Ukraine is responding to President Putin's invasion?
It's been frustrating for the past 8 years, I say. Putin and his cronies has done a pretty good job of shutting down the internet and the information from our side. I must admit that. So even now they're closing down Facebook, Twitter, and whatnot. So I don't have high hopes for Russians just seeing the truth that we are seeing with our own eyes and changing their opinions or taking it to the streets themselves. I'm afraid, as much as I hope that Russians will deal with their very Russian problem of a mad dictator of a president, I still think we are alone in this right now, and I don't expect Russians to fix it anytime soon. It is frustrating. We are doing what we can.
We will be thinking of you as the day goes on. Andrew Abbey, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is 8 o'clock and you are watching a special ITV news programme on the war in Ukraine. The latest developments so far this morning. Attacks continue on cities and towns across Ukraine. The town of Irpin, north of the capital, the focus of intense fighting. The UK's Ministry of Defence says Russia is bombing cities to try to break the morale of the Ukrainian people. Ukraine's President Zelensky, urged his citizens not to retreat and to continue fighting. He has once again called on the West to impose a no-fly zone. Outside the capital Kiev, a huge convoy stretching some 40 miles still remains stalled. Visa and MasterCard have suspended their operations in Russia in reaction to the conflict. And 800,000 refugees have now made their way across the border into Poland. In total, 1.3 million people have fled the fighting so far. Let's just take a look at a live shot of the morning in Kiev, looking peaceful and in stark contrast to some of the scenes we have seen, scenes of war that we have seen since the invasion 11 days ago. Good morning to you and thank you for joining us for this special programme on ITV on day 11 of the war in Ukraine as cities and towns continued to be bombarded. The UK's Ministry of Defence has said overnight that we are in a situation where they believe that Russia is bombing cities to try to break the morale of the Ukrainian people. And of course, the President Zelensky has urged his citizens not to retreat and continue fighting. Well, earlier this week, the Prime Minister visited Eastern Europe and some of the neighbouring countries affected by the war in Ukraine. But during his visit to Poland, he was questioned by a Ukrainian journalist over the support NATO had offered and why he wasn't visiting Ukraine. In a moment, we'll speak to Dr Arena. But first, let's hear a bit of her question to the Prime Minister on Tuesday.
Ukrainian women and Ukrainian children are in deep fear because of bombs and missiles which are going from the sky. And Ukrainian people are desperately asking for the West to protect our sky. We are asking for the no-fly zone. So you're coming to Poland. You're not coming to Kiev, Prime Minister. You're not coming to Lviv because you are afraid. Because NATO is not...
Daria, thank you very much for joining us this morning. You clearly didn't get the response you wanted from the UK's Prime Minister, and so far no sign of change from the UK or indeed from NATO. Can you understand why? Obviously, we're looking at these horrendous pictures coming out of Ukraine and people being killed, but can you understand why the option of a no-fly zone for NATO is unpalatable, as well as the fact that the killings in Ukraine are unpalatable to the world right now?
I can't understand that response. I can't understand why NATO is so much afraid of direct contradiction with Russia. We had this answer before, that the West is afraid to impose sanctions before invasion because the West is afraid to provoke Russia. Now Russia fully occupied Ukraine, not fully occupied, but Russia started the large-scale war in Ukraine, and then sanctions are being imposed. But sanctions take time. The result of sanctions take time. Sanctions do not protect us from bombs. Our army is fighting. Our even disabled persons in Ukraine are protecting Molotov cocktails. So, but we can't protect ourselves. We can't protect our cities, hospitals, our kindergartens from Russian missiles and bombs. And I'm hearing that NATO decided that no-fly zone is not an option. Okay, but what is the alternative? Is the alternative for millions of people simply to die, either being shot by bombs?
Daria, we've just lost you there for a moment. We will, of course, try to get you back. I'm joined by Robert Moore. This is such an emotive issue. It seems, on one level, on the surface, quite a simple issue that surely we should do all that we can to help. We can't. NATO can't be seen to be doing that for a really simple reason.
Exactly. I mean, look, everybody's deeply sympathetic to what Daria and others in Ukraine are calling for, but let's be clear, strategically clear about and tactically clear about what the implications of a no-fly zone are. NATO, the 30 nations of NATO, would need dominance of the skies. To do that, they would need, before even a no-fly zone exists, they would have to eliminate the Russian threat. That means a NATO bombing southern Russian airfields, taking out Russian radar installations, anti-missile sites. It means dogfights in the skies over Ukraine and southern Russia. If a NATO aircrew has to bail out, it means sending in special forces to try and extract that aircrew that may have been, parachuted to the ground. It takes us, let's be clear about this, straight into a NATO-wide Russian conflict. And then that spills over. It's not just the 30 nations of NATO against Russia. Obviously, Ukraine's involved, Moldova, Georgia could get sucked in. We're talking about a Europe-wide war if this no-fly zone is implemented. So even though, people can be enormously sympathetic about the concept of it, the strategic viability of a no-fly zone, I think, really isn't there. So it would just almost certainly lead to what people fear the most about this conflict, which is contagion, never forgetting that the actual mass casualties are being inflicted in any case by Russian artillery. So a no-fly zone doesn't save the cities of Kharkiv or Mariupol or potentially Odessa or Kiev itself. So there are so many issues with the no-fly zone that are deeply problematic, even though we understand those calls from Daria and, of course, from the Ukrainian president as well.
And if we needed any clarification on the issue from what the UK, from what NATO has been saying, we got that from President Putin, didn't we? He said a no-fly zone yesterday. He said it would be a declaration of war. Exactly. And not only a declaration of war, it's a declaration of war with a country that has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So, a no-fly zone, it's not like doing that over Kurdistan or Bosnia or even Syria, all of which have been discussed or tried before. This would be a no-fly zone that takes NATO, the 30 nations of NATO, directly into conflict, into war with Russia. And that's why you can hear, people from Washington to London, Berlin and Paris all saying, hold on a second, a no-fly zone probably wouldn't help the people of Ukraine. And strategically, it puts us on an absolute, almost immediate collision course
in terms of an armed conflict with Russia. So it's the kind of, for Western strategists, it's actually the nightmare scenario, not the salvation for the Ukrainian people.
Is the West paralysed, though, given all that then? Because the West doesn't, of course, want to engage in a nuclear war for very obvious reasons. But we don't know what President Putin is thinking.
I don't think it's paralysed because the West does have options. Not only does it have options, it's implementing options. It's basically sending in huge numbers of weapons to Ukraine. In other words, it's waging kind of a proxy war. We know that sort of Javelin anti-tank missiles are going in. Anti-aircraft missiles are also pouring in to try and boost the defence of Ukraine. And there's another domain, a sort of remote domain, if you like, that's being waged by the West, which is cyberspace. So there's no question in my mind that the West is now beginning to ramp up cyber operations against the Russian Federation and against the Russian military to try and slow down its advance across Ukraine. It's still a key Western core interest to try and ensure that the Russian invasion of Ukraine fails. It just cannot do that in terms of a direct military confrontation with Russia. So it has to look at other more creative options.
This assessment that President Putin's invasion isn't quite going to plan, talks of the military convoy being stalled, him being surprised by the Ukrainians' reaction, by President Zelensky's strength. Does that put Ukraine and the rest of the world in a safer or more fragile position that potentially President Putin has been surprised by what has happened in the first 11 days?
I think there's no question that President Putin has miscalculated, underestimated the strength of Ukrainian resistance, underestimated President Zelensky in particular. But on the other hand, seen through the prism of the Kremlin, this is kind of a long-term operation. What the Russians want to try and create out of Ukraine is a sort of a buffer zone, something that gives them sort of security in depth as they see it. So this is not an operation that will last, a few weeks or even a few months. This is kind of a multi-year operation to try and eliminate the possibility that NATO or the EU will begin to embrace Ukraine. So this is a kind of a long-term strategic ambition of President Putin's, reckless though it may be. This could last years, and I think it's, we over-focus perhaps on this stalled convoy north of Kiev, which has been there for 11 days, hasn't made any progress. But President Putin is not seeing this in terms of days or months. He's seeing this as a multi-year strategy to ensure that his southern border isn't sort of embraced by NATO, doesn't become a NATO member, doesn't become a strategic threat to the Russian Federation as he sees it.
OK. Robert, for now, thank you very much. Thank you. We can return now to Nick Dixon, who is in the Polish town of Przemyśl, close to the Polish-Ukrainian border. Nick, Poland has accepted a huge number of refugees. How much longer can they continue to do that?
Well, that's the question, really. I mean, they're coping now because they absolutely have to. Polish border control have said that as of yesterday, they've had well over 825,000 people crossing over from the Ukraine into the country since the 24th of February. Invariably, they're coming to places like this retail park. Technically, it's a sort of processing centre, a refugee processing centre, but ultimately it really is a retail park which is now swamped with volunteers and refugees as well. You can just see further in the distance there, that's an indoor shopping centre now. At the moment, there are upwards of 1,000 people in there sleeping and resting after their horrendous journeys. A lot of mothers and children, as we've been seeing over the last few days, coming in. So they're getting some rest in there. They're getting baby products, medicines, things like that. But as I say, the volunteers are doing their best to help people as much as possible. They've set up a sort of village community area here with stalls where you can get water, there's clothing, there's baby supplies, toys for people. There's helpline numbers for people who can get information about their next steps. What on earth are they going to do next? Where are they going to go? Just over here you can see one of the mobile phone networks have set up a little help centre. They're giving out SIM cards for people arriving from the Ukraine because obviously their phones may not be working when they arrive into the country. They're doing everything that they can. The buses are arriving every few minutes in this area here. We've been here a couple of hours. At least a dozen or so buses have arrived direct from the border, with anywhere between 50 to 200 people on each of the buses. In terms of when they arrive here, as I say, it is a processing centre, so they may well be here just a couple of hours. They may stay overnight, just get some drinks, some hot food, etc. before moving on. Some people are fortunate. They're coming over from the Ukraine and they may have friends, family or contacts so they can move on fairly quickly, but many others are going to hotels, hostels, apartments, and that's how the Polish authorities want this to proceed at the moment, at least. They certainly don't want to be in a situation where they're setting up hundreds of refugee camps around the country, but as you said earlier, you do have to wonder how long they can cope with these massive numbers, more than 800,000 so far, but expected to go well over 1 million.
Yeah, Nick, I think I was reading yesterday that in Syria it took 3 months to get to a number of 1 million refugees. And in the Ukraine invasion, we saw that number reach 1 million within a week. I mean, the numbers are going to go up rapidly, aren't they, as this invasion continues?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the sort of conservative estimates here are certainly well upwards of 1 million, but potentially up to 3 million. I mean, it's staggering how they're managing to cope at the moment, but it's equally impressive what they have done. I mean, I've been to multiple different refugee centres in this area, whether it is retail parks, train stations, town halls, schools. There's, on the outskirts of this area, there's a huge warehouse that's been set up, and again, it has room for well over 2,000 people to sleep inside there. And the key at the moment is to get people into these reception centres, but to move them on as quickly as they can whilst they've got hotel space, apartment space, hostel space, and of course a lot of people will already have contacts, or they may have friends and family in neighbouring countries, but you have to assume at some point they're going to run into problems, but so far they are managing pretty well.
All in the depths of winter as well, of course. Nick Dixon, for now, thank you very much for that update. Thank you. Well, in response to that growing humanitarian crisis, the Disasters Emergency Committee launched an emergency appeal on Thursday. Let me just bring you an update on that. It has already raised £85 million. Well, Oxfam GB are one of the member charities, and their chief executive, Danny Sriskandarajahar, joins me now. Thank you very much. Just give us the context of what in three days, £85 million being raised. How does that compare to other DEC appeals?
Good morning. Look, £85 million in the first 2 days of an appeal is absolutely incredible. It's a demonstration of the generosity of the British people, and we haven't seen that level of support since the Asian tsunami back in 2004. It's just an indication of, you know, despite all that's going on here and how nervous people must be feeling about rising prices, that people are still prepared to be very generous, and all of the member charities in the DEC are so grateful for that support so far.
Yeah, the tsunami, a natural disaster that everyone the world over had to deal with, and obviously so very many thousands of people lost their lives, and everyone was desperately wanting to help in any way that they could. This appeal is after the actions of one single man, of President Putin deciding to invade Ukraine. That must be very frustrating, to be involved in this level of work and crisis with so very many desperate people, when it's down to something that an individual, it didn't need to happen. We didn't need to be in this position.
Well, look, we are humanitarian agencies, and it's not our role to comment on crises like this. Our role is to really respond. And, you know, as your correspondent from Poland just showed, you know, there are already over 1 million people who've had to flee what's going on in Ukraine. The United Nations is expecting that number could rise as much as 4 million people who've had to cross international borders. And of course, there are lots of people who are moving within Ukraine, or are stuck at home in their homes, hiding and sheltering without necessarily having food or supply or water. And so, you know, the job of humanitarian agencies like Oxfam, World Vision, the British Red Cross, Save the Children, is to do as much as we can to deal with this unfolding human tragedy that we're seeing in Europe. Yeah,
the numbers you speak of there, 4 million potentially, it's just astonishing, isn't it? Have you had experience of those kinds of numbers in such a short period of time? I was just comparing it earlier to the Syrian conflict, where it took 3 months to get to 1 million people, and we're already, the latest figures show 1.3 million people have fled Ukraine. And obviously we know people are trying to get out of Mariupol. They would have gone yesterday if that ceasefire, that temporary ceasefire, had been respected.
Look, the tragedy in some ways is Oxfam has been around for 80 years. We were founded in 1942 in the middle of the Second World War. And the tragedy is organizations like ours of having to respond time and again to, as you said, these man-made crises of conflict that have happened around the world and displacement. And yes, we have in places like Syria, in parts of Africa, in Darfur a few years ago, had to respond to large-scale movement of people. We saw it only a couple of years ago in Myanmar and Bangladesh with the flow of Rohingya refugees. So the sad reality is organizations like ours have had to respond to these sorts of conflicts. But this is a scale that's unprecedented, it seems. It's certainly, in the space of a few days to see this many people who've moved across international borders it is a scale that we haven't seen in recent times. And so we and of course local organizations in places like Poland, in Romania, in Moldova, are scrambling a response as quickly as possible, and doing as best as we can in the short term, but also preparing for what this might mean in the long term in places like those.
Yeah, of course, it's not just the instant need, but what happens next when you have such a quantity of displaced people, of displaced families, potentially all across Europe. Right now, the £85 million that has been donated from people in the UK, who I guess are feeling helpless and powerless, and this is one thing that they can do to try to feel as if they are doing something in the face of what they're seeing in terms of those pictures out of Ukraine, in terms of families separated, in terms of families stranded who can't get basic supplies in the port city of Mariupol. Practically speaking, the DEC has got this sum total of £85 million. I'm sure it's going to be rising. How will that money be spent? How will you get help to where it's needed? Not only the refugees in Poland and beyond, but those who are trapped because they had to stay. They might be people with disabilities, or those who have chosen to stay and resist what is happening in Ukraine.
So one of the amazing things about the DEC is it's 15 major established charities that come together at moments like this. And we're grateful for the support we receive. What it enables us to do together is work out how each of us can add value. So if you take the British Red Cross or the Red Cross movement, for example, they have a presence in Ukraine, and they're already supplying emergency supplies, food, water, hygiene kits, first aid support to people inside Ukraine at the moment. Age International, which is part of, which Age UK is part of, is working with local organizations in Ukraine to help older people who are amongst the groups you've just mentioned. Many older people, unfortunately, aren't able to leave Ukraine, and so are stuck sometimes without food and water. And so Age UK's partners inside Ukraine are trying to help those people. Meanwhile, agencies like Oxfam and several other member agencies of the DEC are in the neighboring countries trying to support those first responders, the Polish organizations, for example, or communities that are trying to deal with this response. And we're supplying, again, food or cash in some cases to people who've had to leave with only what they can carry. And so this response already is multifaceted. It's happening in different ways in different parts of this response. And as I said, what we also have to pay attention to is that this is what we're doing in the short term, but we also have to think about what are the best ways to respond to the long-term implications of these flows, including, of course, the likely refugee flows that might happen across the rest of Europe, and being sure that we are supporting those refugees and governments are doing what they can to welcome people as they flee from this conflict.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll come to that, the long-term implications as this goes on. Danny Sriskanda-Rajha, thank you very much for talking to me this morning about Oxfam's work as part of the Disasters Emergency Committee response to the invasion of Ukraine. Thank you very much. Let's rejoin our correspondent, Robert Moore. We have to have hope. We have to continue with that. What hope for diplomacy? We saw yesterday this meeting that many said wouldn't happen between the Israeli Prime Minister and President Putin.
I think the prospect of a sort of broad diplomatic solution is vanishingly small at the moment. But you're right to say that, you know, given the risk of contagion, given the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding, you know, diplomats will always try and keep avenues of dialogue open. And one country, perhaps the only country that has really good, strong relations with both Moscow and Kiev is Israel. That's because it has large parts of the Jewish population in Israel, traces its heritage back both to Russia and to Ukraine. And, you know, there's a big Jewish population in Ukrainian cities like Odessa, historically. So Israel has the capacity to play the role of an intermediary. But at the moment, you know, it doesn't seem like either side's anywhere close to that. In fact, Russia moving up the escalation ladder still, because it's talking about, you know, regarding any imposition of a no-fly zone as an act of war, for example. Now, as we've discussed, the no-fly zone, in my view, is certainly not a viable option for NATO countries. But it does tell you that even as that's being considered and Russia regarding that as an act of war, that we're nowhere near diplomacy. I mean, even yesterday, when there was sort of the opportunity for a micro diplomacy in terms of establishing a humanitarian corridor to allow civilians to evacuate from Mariupol, even that broke down within hours of being established. It shows you the immense distrust. Ukraine feels it has it's able to take on these Russian forces in their country. They're feeling kind of resilient and defiant. Russia has this long-term goal of trying to ensure that Ukraine never becomes a perceived threat as seen by the Kremlin. So the prospect of diplomacy, I'm afraid, is very grim, even as countries like Israel try and keep a dialogue open to both capitals.
What about, we saw early in the week a 90-minute phone call between President Macron and President Putin, the lines of communication they're still open. Any hope from that point of view? Obviously, from President Macron's point of view, he came away from that, I think, with less hope, it's fair to say, than before he went into it.
Yeah, I think the sort of Paris-Moscow kind of dialogue is almost over. I think Macron has every reason to feel badly betrayed in terms of how events unfolded. There is another actor in this, a highly, influential and powerful actor we haven't talked about, Beijing. And that's why Washington is trying to get the sort of Chinese leadership to put pressure on Moscow, because, the axis between Beijing and Moscow is extremely strong, and China is now the dominant partner in that relationship. And I think, for Moscow, if China began to sort of side with the West, if it began to withdraw any sort of support for Moscow, then that would be a game changer. So that's why, China is a country to watch and to see how its diplomats figure this out. At the moment, of course, they abstained in the UN Security Council. But if Washington could try and get China to put pressure on President Putin, that's the one area of international diplomacy that could potentially be a game changer.
Robert, what's the latest on Belarus? Because we keep hearing conflicting accounts of whether Belarus have joined Russia in this conflict or haven't yet. Obviously, we have seen some sanctions on that country because of the thought that they have joined the invasion.
I think see Minsk as a client state, essentially, of Russia now. They're fully embedded with the sort of Russian narrative, the Russian view of Ukraine. So, I think the Russian-Belarus alliance is strong. We haven't seen Belarus actually involve its military yet, but of course, their territory is now the major launching pad for an attack on Kiev. So, Belarus is following Moscow's orders closely, and therefore there's not much hope there of trying to separate Minsk and Moscow. It's a matter of trying to put pressure on Moscow from Beijing and potential other allies that the West could try and reach out to.
What is your thinking of what we could see in the next couple of days?
Well, I'm afraid to say all the evidence is it's going to get worse because, we've got this siege warfare now being conducted around Mariupol and Kharkiv. We now fear that Odessa and Kiev are next in the next few days. So, it's going to get worse. And the Russian military tactics, as we know from the air bombardment of Aleppo by the Russian Air Force, by the Second Chechen War, we know what the tactics are. We know the Russian playbook, if you like, and it's unbelievably kind of brutal. It doesn't engage in the sort of, the laws of warfare. And so I'm afraid to say, even as we are kind of spectators to this tragedy, it is going to get, the news is going to get even more grim in the coming days. I think that's inevitable. But, whether in a week or two diplomacy suddenly gets rejuvenated, that remains to be seen.
OK, Robert, for now, thank you very much for your latest analysis, of course. It is just coming up to 8:30. A quick look at the latest developments on the Ukraine conflict. A new temporary ceasefire has been announced in the southern city of Mariupol to allow civilians to leave safely. Evacuations will start at midday local time. Attacks continue on cities and towns across Ukraine. The town of Irpin, north of the capital, the focus of intense fighting. And we've learned that £85 million has been raised for the DEC charity appeal. It's described as an incredible show of support from the UK public. Well, let's get the latest now from our Europe editor, James Mates, who, as you know, is in the capital, Kiev. Just before I talk to you about the capital, can I just talk to you about Mariupol and this announcement that they are going to try again with the ceasefire? What's the latest you're hearing about that in terms of people trying to flee that city?
Well, in about an hour and a half's time, so 10 a.m. London time, midday here, they say that the humanitarian corridor that was supposed to open yesterday, of course never really did, will open again for a period of 11 hours. So we will see this time whether anything more significant happens. I mean, the Russians had agreed to it yesterday. A whole convoy of people were heading out of Mariupol thinking it was going to be safe, finding it wasn't, having to return back in and to their homes. So we'll see today, but I mean, this is no small movement going on here. 400,000 people in Mariupol. A very, very significant evacuation needs to be done there, given the state of a city that's the size of Southampton, a major port, and under siege and under fire.
And for any viewers who have just joined us who didn't see your earlier update from the capital, a relatively calm night overnight. Just take us through where the capital is at right now, 11 days into this invasion, and no sign of the capital city being occupied by Russian forces.
No, in terms of territory that the Russians hold or are attacking, basically day 11 is very similar to day 1 in that they have come into the northwest corner of the northwest suburbs, really, I should say, towns like Irpin and Bucha, and that is where the fighting is still going on. You can hear it, actually, the rumble in the distance. It's about 25 miles away, so it's hard to see very much, but you do hear the rumble of artillery and of explosions. It is up there, of course, that that stuck convoy is basically heading as well, and essentially nothing has moved. The Ukrainians now worry that the Russians are going to dig in there and form defensive lines, and from there use heavy artillery and their multi-launch rocket systems to start attacking the city itself, which would, of course, be a major escalation in terms of the civilian population of Kiev.
And practically speaking, right now, what's the latest on curfews in the capital?
Curfew from 8 a.m. At night until 5 or 6 in the morning. Very, very strict rules about being out and about in the city during curfew. And in fact, you go out here even outside of curfew hours, and there are obviously troops everywhere. A lot of people checking who you are, checking your documents, why you're around. Considerable nervousness on the part of the city's defenders, as you'd expect, because of fears that there are sabotage groups, that there are mercenaries, that there are assassination squads, all the fears you'd expect, and almost certainly not unjustified fears.
Absolutely. I'm sure we'll come on to that as the morning goes on. For now, James, thank you very much. I'm joined now by the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Thank you very much for coming in to talk to us this morning. What would you be doing different to the Prime Minister if you were the Prime Minister on this situation in Ukraine right now?
Well, the first thing I should say is that we support NATO, we support allies, we support Ukraine, and we stand united in the United Kingdom. Putin wants us to divide and on party political lines, and we're not going to do so. I do want to push the Prime Minister further and faster on sanctions. Everybody understands why we can't have a no-fly zone, why direct military assistance is not possible. That means sanctions have to be the strongest we have ever seen, the most effective we've ever seen. And in order for sanctions to work, you need to know what property the oligarchs have got here in the United Kingdom. And at the moment, the government is saying that they will have to register that ownership, quite right too, but they'll have 6 months to do that. Now, our concern is that in that 6 months, there's time to sell property and therefore it'll never be registered, never be sanctioned. That should be 28 days. So I want to push the Prime Minister much further than that, and we'll be trying to do that tomorrow.
You say that you want the government to be stronger on sanctions. Russia clearly thinks the UK is being very strong already. It's talked yesterday of the fact that it's effectively leading the way, and we will see retaliation because of that.
Well, it's very important if we're going to support Ukraine that we have the strongest possible sanctions, and I want the world to think they're the strongest possible sanctions across the world. There are measures being taken by lots of different countries. We must play our part, and I do think we can go further in relation to that registration, because in the end, if people can sell their properties before they're even registered, then the whole point of sanctions falls away. I think there's another area where the government could move as well, and that is in relation to those oligarchs that are using our courts to suppress critics and challengers, expensive legal cases that close down challenge and free speech. We want to see the government go much harder there. Again, there's going to be an amendment tomorrow in Parliament that we hope to push the government further. So, yes, we support what the government is doing, but we do think they could go further and faster, and going to be pushing them to do that tomorrow.
On that issue, you want new laws being brought in, and you want to be at the table with the Prime Minister to work together to bring those new laws in. Have you had a response from Downing Street yet on that?
No, we haven't. There's plenty of time before we vote tomorrow. There's cross-party support, so there are plenty of Conservative MPs who are concerned, because everybody can see that if you've got 6 months to register your property, then if you think it's going to be taken or frozen, then you're likely to get rid of it. So there's a lot of concern, cross-party concern. I want the government to listen to what we're saying today, reflect on it, and if the government comes forward tomorrow and says, look, we accept Labour's amendment or any amendment that says these registrations should be, let's say, in 28 days, then good, we've made progress. There's a bit of frustration here, I have to say, because these issues are not new. There was something called the Russia report of 2 years ago now that pointed out why we needed some of these measures, and the government hasn't acted quickly enough. So there's a frustration, but I'm determined that that frustration doesn't lead to division, because I think that Putin wants to see us divided, and we're not going to let him see us divided. We're going to be united, standing up to Russian aggression.
In terms of Russian influence on either our elections or our political parties, lots of criticism about the Tory party and Russian donations. Has the Labour Party got a clean sheet on Russian donations coming into your party?
Yes, we have. We've got nothing to disclose. I think there is, you're right, a growing concern that the Russian
money that has supported the Labour Party?
No, that's right. We've been through and checked that. But there is concern about the donations to the Conservative Party. I think the right thing to do is for them to review those donations, check whether there's any link at all to Putin, and if there is, to get rid of those donations as quickly as possible. I'd call on the Conservative Party to do that, because I think all the time there are these allegations of links of any sort, money or others, in relation to the Conservative Party. It gives legs to the argument that one of the reasons the government isn't moving fast enough is because they've got an interest in this. And so for their own sakes, it will be in their own interest to look again at those donations
No
and be doubly
donations
sure about where they've
to
come
the Labour
from.
Party in any point in the last.
No, I'm confident
time
about donations into the Labour Party. We've got very, very strict rules.
As the leader, okay. In terms of, you mentioned this very kind of live issue of this no-fly zone and that you don't support that. Some in your party have said that they do. Can you just explain to our viewers, because some of them who hear politicians in this country, in America, say there's absolutely no way that that can be on the table, and yet they're seeing these scenes, just in the simplest of terms, why that is an unpalatable option for NATO?
Well, firstly, I understand that human emotion. Anybody looking at those images is seeing things that we didn't think we would see in our lifetimes. Russian tanks rolling into a European state, soldiers kissing their children goodbye, and families fleeing for the border. The problem, or the reason that NATO has said we will not have a no-fly zone, we won't put offensive military troops on the ground, is because that would escalate the situation to a point where everybody would be drawn into a massive conflict. And so, of course, on a human level, everybody can see why there is that argument. But everybody equally, I think, understands why it can't be allowed to escalate. It does mean that if we can't have a no-fly zone for the reasons that are obvious, I think, to most people who look at it, the sanctions have to absolutely work. And that doesn't mean just isolating Russia. It means making sure Russia can't function as a country. That's why it's so important that the government goes further and faster tomorrow. And I really hope that the government will respond to what we're saying today, respond to that cross-party appeal to go further, because those sanctions have to do the work of pushing Putin back, forcing a ceasefire, and getting him to withdraw his troops.
You could look at the situation and say that the West is paralysed by fear of President Putin, fear of him being a nuclear power, and fear of his rhetoric that is already escalating. He is talking of the fact that sanctions themselves are akin to a declaration of war. There was a caveat in what he said yesterday, in that, thank goodness, that isn't the plan right now. But we don't seem to be able to do anything in the face of what effectively is one person bullying this country of Ukraine and the rest of the world in terms of their response. We are so limited.
I wouldn't characterise it like that. I think Putin expected NATO and our allies to be divided on this, that we wouldn't be able to get together to have strong sanctions, the provision of equipment into Ukraine, agreements on humanitarian assistance. He thought that the West wouldn't be able to do that. In a week or 10 days or so, there has been an incredibly united response, the strongest sanctions that we've seen across the world so far. And that is very important, because I think that is the tool that we have to defeat Putin. And we have to show that his aggression can't work, because he's made the gamble. He's decided that the benefits, if you like, of aggression outweigh the consequences, and we have to prove him wrong. And I think most people, in fairness, would say, if you look at what all the countries across the world have done, those that are standing up for Ukraine, those that are against Russia, they have done more than most people thought, and they've acted with greater unity than most people thought was possible. And that's very, very important, and it's one of the reasons that we in the Labour Party, as the opposition, don't want to have division in this country, because at a moment like this, we absolutely have to stand together in the face of this aggression from Putin.
But we've also seen in that 11 days, haven't we, Russian troops attack a nuclear power station, something that would have been, even 11 days ago, would be unthinkable. We woke up to that news. So we're in a situation where every step of this, whether it's a ceasefire that's been agreed to allow people to escape a city under siege, or the unthinkable that a foreign state would attack something as devastating as a nuclear power station, it seems to be President Putin is one step ahead of us in doing something that is even more unthinkable than the last action.
Well, it is unthinkable, and I think many, many people were shocked when they saw what had happened with the nuclear power station. And it just shows what can happen when you have a war of aggression like this. But I think this idea that Putin is getting what he wants, that everything's going his way, is wrong. We've all seen the incredible courage of the people of Ukraine fighting in their cities and in their towns. And it's not going Putin's way. He didn't expect the united response that the West has been able to put in. And we have to beat him at this and show that that aggression will not pay. It isn't going to be easy, but we have to stand united. And that's why the absolutely strongest measures need to be in place. That's why it's so important tomorrow that the government listens to what we're saying and goes further and faster in relation to sanctions.
What you're also saying is you are still putting the pressure on Boris Johnson over the Partygate allegations. Is this the right time, given all the talk of unity that you're talking about against a common enemy, as you will, to be talking about that domestic issue that the country's also facing?
Well, I do think there's an issue of trust, and in a time like this, it's very important that the public have trust in their leaders. But I can tell you, in the debate in Parliament tomorrow, we won't be talking about Partygate. We will be absolutely focused on the amendments that we need to pass to toughen up the sanctions regime. So our challenge to the government tomorrow is to go further and to go faster on this. There is a frustration that the economic crime bill, which we're debating tomorrow, is going to bring in the sanctions. That's been debated, we've been talking about that bill for 2 years. We could have had all of this on the statute book. These measures could already be in place. So there's a frustration, but it's a frustration that's born of wanting to go further and faster. And so tomorrow, what you will hear is a debate, a challenge to the government, but in the spirit of saying, let's together as one parliament put together the strongest possible sanctions. And we will all vote together tomorrow when it comes to those tough sanctions as a show of unity to Putin. We will not be divided on this. OK, well, we'll put some of your thoughts to the Deputy Prime Minister, hopefully a little later on this morning. Sir Keir Starmer, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. Thank you. Our political reporter Shihab Khan joins me now from Downing Street. You were listening to what Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, had to say there. What is your assessment of it?
Yeah, I think the key message there from Sir Keir Starmer is one of unity, this idea of having to work together because we are at such a critical time for Europe. There's an acceptance from the Labour leader that military intervention, that no-fly zone, isn't something that the government is willing to do or able to do right now, and there wasn't much criticism of that. Instead, the focus was on sanctions, which appears and has been for some time the key part of the government's strategy to try and slow down Putin. The Labour leader says that they're going to try and push the Prime Minister to go further on sanctions, to do them quicker. The question will be whether or not that's something the government is able to do and willing to do, because ultimately for sanctions to work, it's something that needs to be done across the entire planet. The US, the European Union and the UK need to work together for that to happen. It's also very interesting to hear the Labour leader talk about Russian donations into our politics and whether or not the Conservative Party has been influenced by that. That's something that we've heard quite a lot about in the last few weeks. It'll be interesting to hear whether the Labour leader focuses on that next week when he's in the House of Commons. This idea that we understand that NATO allies need to work together, again, is something which is ever slightly different to what we've heard from previous Labour leaders, and it's quite clear that Keir Starmer is trying to make that distinction and show that he's willing to work with the government on this. When you have these sort of situations, it is incredibly important that both sides do come together, and that's something that he was stressing quite a lot in that interview. The key thing moving forward is whether or not consensus can be built by both the Labour Party and across Westminster on how those sanctions, if there are to be further sanctions. And if you remember that 6-point plan that we spoke about earlier in the programme that the Prime Minister's talking about, in that 6-point plan, there is talk about ramping up sanctions if we get to that point, because ultimately, as Keir Starmer says, it is the best tool that we have available to us. If we're not willing to implement a no-fly zone, if we're not willing to put boots on the ground, it is essentially the best way to try and slow down Putin, to try and slow down the invasion and ultimately get to the ceasefire. The question will be whether or not consensus can be built, not only in Westminster but across the planet, to make sure that that's the best and what's the most strategic way of doing that to have the most meaningful impact.
OK, Shihab Khan, thank you very much for that assessment. Thank you. The message from Ukraine about what the world can do to help Ukraine is consistent. consistent, enforce a no-fly zone. President Zelensky has repeated that request again in recent hours, but his pleas are likely, as they have until now, to fall on deaf ears. The West has shown little appetite to get itself involved in the current conflict, militarily at least. There are, though, some in Westminster who want the idea to be considered. Any idea that could mean redeploying UK jets currently patrolling the Baltic states sent to police the skies above Ukraine, as our political correspondent Carl Dinnan now reports.
It's 3:30 in the morning, and at RAF Bryce Norton we join a Voyager aircraft as it prepares to take off for a rendezvous over Germany. Refuelling pods are slung beneath the wings. A couple of hours after takeoff, and two more aircraft appear from the darkness. A pair of Typhoon fighters from RAF Coningsby have joined the mission. Soon after dawn, it is time to top up their tanks. The aircraft are just northwest of Hamburg, 27,000 feet up, and travelling at 400 miles per hour. The Typhoons take on board 3 tons of fuel each before departing on the next leg of their mission. The Typhoons are patrolling the Polish-Russian border. It's a policing mission and they are armed, but the main aim is to see and to be seen by the Russian forces just across the frontier. But there are those, including senior MPs, who think that the West should be taking a much more muscular approach and enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine itself.
I'm supportive of us considering the idea. What we did was to dismiss it publicly straight away. And in my view, this is senseless. You never project to your adversary what you plan not to do, because that simply gives them space to take advantage of what our red lines are. I would have kept the other side guessing, even if privately we had done our calculations and said, no, this isn't possible.
No-fly zones have been used with a degree of success in the past, notably over Iraq. But ministers argue that the Russians are not relying on their air power over Ukraine. And of course, NATO does not want to get into a hot war with Russia.
On a no-fly zone, allies agree that we should not have NATO planes operating over Ukrainian airspace or NATO troops on Ukrainian territory.
The presence of the Voyager allows a much longer patrolling time. These are long flights for all of the crews, and as NATO steps up its patrols along the Russian border in response to the invasion of Ukraine, they are having to fly more of them. And no one can tell how long they will go on, but at least they are limited to NATO airspace for now.
See you later, guys. See you later. Have a good one. Take care.
Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Bryce Norton.
Let's speak more to our correspondent, Robert Moore. Sanctions it is then, but in light of the sanctions we've seen thus far, we've also seen both the attacks and the rhetoric coming from the Kremlin, from President Putin himself, both escalating. The sanctions, it would appear, are not working.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we all heard what Sir Keir Starmer said there, a powerful plea for ever tighter sanctions. I mean, there's two problems with that. One is that it isn't appearing to change the calculus in the Kremlin. The other problem, which, few politicians are prepared to kind of address head on, is that this is not Russia's war on Ukraine. It's Putin's war on Ukraine. And it's not clear what the sort of long-term implications of trying to crush Russian opinion and economic development are. It's possible that it would lead to just a growth of Russian nationalism, isolationism, hostility to the West. So there's always a danger that actually sanctions could be counterproductive and could boost Putin's position.
We have seen, haven't we, since the invasion, some incredibly brave Russians protesting in major cities in Russia. There has been talk of President Putin bringing in martial law to combat these protests. Is there any update on that in terms of, do you think that could happen? And what would be the response of the Russian people if suddenly they saw their leader, their president, reacting like that to what they were doing in relation to this invasion?
Well, President Putin has now suggested that that talk of martial law is not valid, that he wasn't thinking about that and would only implement it in extreme military circumstances. But you're right to point out the bravery of ordinary Russians who have taken to the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other cities across Russia to protest. I mean, it's a remarkable act of bravery, if you like. You know, we focused our attention rightly on the bravery and resilience of Ukrainians. But the tragedy isn't just playing out in Ukraine, it's also playing out in Russia. You know, the Russian opposition leader is behind bars. Russian civil opposition is being crushed ruthlessly. Information is being suppressed. You know, we've seen in the last sort of 48 hours the kind of last vestiges of Russian independent journalism and investigative journalism utterly crushed. So we said yesterday, I think accurately, that, you know, we're moving from an authoritarian state in Russia to a totalitarian state. So this is one war, but it's two tragedies, because it's not only Ukraine that is being crushed militarily, but in terms of information and freedom and the hopes that the people had of being a more open, pluralistic society, that in parallel is being crushed. So it's one war, but two tragedies.
And in terms of the impact on ordinary Russian people, in terms of those sanctions, big company after big company after big company, with some notable exceptions, pulling out of that country, including overnight Visa and MasterCard. Exactly.
I mean, you know, devastating for the Russian middle class. If you're a Russian saver, if you've got some money in the bank, you know, you're not responsible for this war, but you're being, you know, seriously damaged economically. And there's another danger that we don't talk about as well, which is sort of Russophobia. You know, Russia is a cultural jewel. It's you know, part of the European family, and yet already we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere, you know, some Russian restaurants and other cultural elements being attacked and being isolated. So there is a fear, I think, that, you know, even though this is Putin's war, it's Russia that is now in the crosshairs, not only of sanctions, but of being ostracized around the world. And that's a tragedy, of course, for Russia, but also for us, because, you know, it rips sort of Russia away from the European family. And so the question, the sort of calibration that Western politicians need to do is to maximize pressure on the Kremlin and President Putin, but not to humiliate the Russian nation in a way that actually fuels nationalism there and then becomes a generational problem for Western policymakers.
You talk of Putin's war. Can we briefly focus on Putin's tactics, and especially for some of our younger viewers who may not have witnessed a conflict in this level before in their lifetimes? When James Mates was talking about saboteurs on the streets and this curfew to protect people in Kiev and in other cities, talk us through, in the simplest of terms, if you will, who these people are and what they're doing in relation to this invasion.
Well, there is a Putin playbook, if you like. We saw it in the Second Chechen War in 1999 and 2000. We saw it in Aleppo. It's brutal military tactics, but also the insertion of mercenaries and other sort of private contractors to fight Moscow's war, including assassination squads and so on. So it's a story about Putin's military tactics, his brutality. We saw it in Grozny, we've seen it in Aleppo, and now we're seeing it in cities like Mariupol, and we fear greatly about Odessa and Kiev in the coming days and weeks.
Robert, I'm sure we'll come back to that. Thank you for now. We can, though, now speak to the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, who joins us. Thank you for speaking to us this morning. I've just spoken to Sir Keir Starmer. He wants cross-party cooperation to work together to tackle Russian oligarchs in this country, to get round the table with the Prime Minister to bring in new laws to stop them suing their critics into silence. Is that something that you will support this morning?
Yes, well, in fact, I made it clear on Wednesday and Thursday that we would be bringing forward proposals. There's a little bit of Captain Hindsight coming from Keir Starmer, but actually we should work together on this, and I hope he'll support me when I bring forward those proposals, which I'll do in a matter of weeks.
Practically speaking, what does that mean, though, in terms of will we see a meeting between the Prime Minister and the Labour leader to get these new laws that Sir Keir Starmer is calling for?
Well, it's not, again, I've already made clear we're going to reform our libel laws, and I'm going to bring forward proposals to do so. What we've seen, and we've seen it in relation to journalists, academics, authors, the kleptocrats and those who are linked with Putin and deep pockets have come to this country and used our jurisdiction to sue those who are shining a light on corruption or the excesses of the Putin regime. That cannot be right. We will not tolerate it, and I'm going to bring forward proposals, and we very much hope the Labour Party will back them, particularly given what Keir said. They could deal with anything from allocation of costs, so that you don't find authors on relatively modest salaries against the might of an oligarch with very deep pockets and basically find themselves bankrupted. We could look at the threshold for defamation in those kinds of cases. The US operates a different threshold. Those are things I want to look through quite carefully, but we'll be bringing forward those proposals quite shortly. I hope the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and indeed the whole of the House of Commons comes together on that.
Dominic Raab, why couldn't you have done this a lot sooner and a lot stronger? This has been a situation that we've been looking at for, as Keir Starmer said, a couple of years, and certainly in the last 11 days. It seems like there was a lot of criticism of the government that you simply haven't taken this situation about Russian money in this country seriously, and you haven't done enough yet, and you could do, and you have to right now.
Well, I don't accept that at all. We've been at the vanguard of the international response in terms of sanctions. You can see the impact it's had, from the measures taken on the SWIFT payment system to the central bank. The Russian ruble's fallen to record lows. The Russian stock market has plummeted. The Russian central bank has had to double interest rates. We've been at the centre, at the vanguard of that. We're bringing forward an economic crimes bill on Monday to deal with things like unexplained wealth orders, to speed up and strengthen the powers there, but also on transparency around corporate interests here. So we've been responding, of course, to events in Ukraine, but also we've been doing this for weeks and indeed years. I mean, if you look back, I'm the Foreign Secretary who brought in the Sergei Magnitsky sanctions regime for gross human rights abuses and for corruption. That's asset freezes and visa bans.
Dominic Raab, let us look back then, and I was hoping you could explain to our viewers why the Conservatives wanted or needed so much Russian money in terms of donations to the Conservative Party over the years.
Well, just to be clear, but first of all, there's no foreign donations made. It's illegal and we don't accept them. Secondly, our complaint is not with Russian people, and many of the entrepreneurs that are here are people who have fled Putin, including some of those that have given to the Conservative Party. And above all of our declarations are properly scrutinised and properly declared. Let's not let this slip into some kind of jingoism, let alone xenophobia against all Russians. I've got in my own constituency Russian children in schools, and we think of, our heart goes out to all the Ukrainians that have suffered. We've also got a lot of Russian, decent, law-abiding people in this country who will be very nervous and anxious right now, and I think we need to be very careful
speaking,
about
Dominic
our
Raab,
language.
specifically, not about Russians in general, but about
Putin.
Russian donations to the Conservative Party. Has the Conservative Party, in part, led to the leader that President Putin seems to have become now?
No, it's total nonsense what you've just said, and I've already rebutted it, but I'm very happy to do it again. There is no foreign donations to the Conservative Party, and you cannot fuse or conflate people that are here, whether they've got UK nationality or legitimately here, who make donations, which we very carefully scrutinise, with our absolutely concerted and rigorous targeting of sanctions on those who are either corrupt or are bankrolling Putin. Let's be very clear about that, and let's not turn this into all Russian or indeed any other nationality that is here.
Okay, let's continue down this route of clarification then. Perhaps you could clarify for our viewers reports in the Sunday Times this morning that the Russian owner of the Evening Standard, Evgeny Lebdev, only got a peerage when Boris Johnson himself, the Prime Minister, intervened after allegations, according to that newspaper, that British intelligence had warned that the owner of the Evening Standard was a risk to national security. Did or did not the Prime Minister intervene in that situation of giving him a peerage?
Well, you will know that I won't comment on anything related to intelligence, and indeed I'm not going to comment on individual cases. I don't know about Mr. Lebedev. What I would say this is the process for a peerage has a very strict and very stringent set of processes, and my understanding, and I've checked obviously very carefully, given I was coming on the news this morning, that they were all applied in relation to that donation, in relation to that peerage.
Okay, Dominic Raab, are you proud of the UK's response to the growing refugee crisis, especially in comparison to EU countries? There's been a lot of criticism over the past week about what this country isn't doing in terms of helping people trying to flee Ukraine right now.
Well, we've been very clear. We're going to provide visas for the family members of who are Ukrainian, related to British nationals here, or indeed Ukrainians here. That will be up to an estimated 200,000. There is also now a humanitarian route that will be uncapped, and we've provided over £200 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. So no, I think we are doing the right thing. It's also, I think, reasonable to say it's the truth in most refugee situations and most conflict situations that those fleeing a war zone or a country will almost always want to go back home if they can, and they will therefore prioritise settling in countries nearest to the conflict zone, in this case Ukraine. So I think it's natural to expect the Central and Eastern European countries to respond in the way they have, and we will support them.
But we've made it complicated, haven't we? The Ukraine helpline wasn't free at first for people to call that. Situations on limited numbers, talk of immediate family, changing that to different relatives. Your own father fled to this country, fleeing Czechoslovakia at the time from the Nazis. We should, in this situation, as a government, as a country, be making it so simple, as it was back then, for anyone who needs to get out of Ukraine to come here, shouldn't we?
Sorry, I don't need to be lectured by you about what my father went through, and you're talking about something you know little about. It was incredibly difficult for my father to get to the UK. He went via a refugee camp in Tangiers, but the truth is, in relation to Ukraine, we're doing the right thing. It's not right to say we've put a limit on the numbers in relation to the humanitarian scheme that the Home Secretary has set up. It is simply our estimate that in relation to the family dependents, we're talking about 200,000. If we didn't give an estimate, you'd ask us for one. And I think we're doing the right thing in the right way. There's been a question about whether we should have security checks. Look, this is people coming from a war zone. It is absolutely right, given the foreign fighters that are there alongside the Russians, that we make sure that we do have security checks, precisely so that our generosity is directed to those who deserve our compassion, not those who might seek to harm us.
Dominic Raab, I certainly wasn't lecturing you. I was just trying to compare a situation of how difficult it can be for all sorts of people to seek refuge in a different country.
Sorry, you don't.
Let's
Sorry, you don't know anything about what my father went through.
Well, I think you've clarified that for us, and I'm very grateful for you for doing that. I just want to bring in my colleague, Robert Moore, who's been listening to what you've had to say so far, who has also got a question for you. Robert.
Mr. Raab, I wanted to ask you about British support militarily for the Ukrainians. Are we engaged in sort of cyber warfare against the Russians? Are we able to conduct some kind of remote warfare to help the Ukrainian people? And on another front, do we support Poland giving MiG-29s to the Ukrainian Air Force, or would we regard that as risking escalation?
Now, we support what our Polish allies are doing. We've obviously provided anti-tank missiles, but you're absolutely right to say that Putin has a track record of hybrid tactics of warfare, which include, and we saw it in relation to Salisbury, the use of chemical weapons, a nerve agent. We've also seen, and throughout the pandemic, the use of cyber attacks. We're obviously very careful about discussing that in public, but what I can tell you is, of course, we're going to be reinforcing our resilience in relation to that in connection with Russia, and in particular the situation in Ukraine.
And Dominic Raab, we heard yesterday this threat of retaliation from Moscow regarding the sanctions that the UK has already put in place, talk of the UK leading the way. How concerned are you about that threat of retaliation? What does that mean to you, and what can you tell our viewers about how you are dealing with that type of threat?
Well, we've, of course, right the way through all of the planning, we've borne in mind what the likely implications would be of the approach we take and the potential backlash, whether it's from cyber or otherwise. But I think what we can say is, you can see that the sanctions and the lead that you rightly described that the UK has taken is working, and it's got them rattled. We've seen the raw effects on the stock market, which has plummeted to record lows, on the ruble, on the central bank of Russia, which has had to double interest rates to 20%. You can imagine what it would be like if we had that in the UK. And the importance of that is to choke off the finance that is funding Putin's war machine. But also it shows to ordinary Russians that actually what they were promised, which was a cakewalk, a peacekeeping mission, is having very serious effects on them as well. So we'll, of course, be very careful about the consequences of all the actions we take, but we're not going to be blackmailed or bullied by Putin, and we are going to keep putting the squeeze on him so that he fails in Ukraine.
The squeeze on him, and yet the attacks on people in Ukraine, the approach, Putin's tactics have escalated. Obviously looking back over the last few days, an attack on a nuclear power station, and of course the rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin escalating as well. These are concerning times, Dominic Raab.
Look, these are very concerning times, and I think we need to get ready for the fact that as he stutters and stumbles in Ukraine, Putin will respond with ever more brutal and bullying tactics, and there's a humanitarian cost to that, and that is why our hearts go out to the people of Ukraine, and that's why the humanitarian assistance and the wider support on visas is going to be there. We need to be braced for the long haul. We need to show strategic stamina, but we're not going to back off from tightening those sanctions. If anything, we will go further as and when we can find ways which are even more effective, and we will keep supporting and reinforcing the Ukrainian effort to resist what Putin's doing. And ultimately, those conscripts, I mean, there's the other big piece in this is going to be war crimes accountability. And it's one of the things that shows our standing in the world, that we have a British chief prosecutor at the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We've also got a judge there. They're entirely independent, but actually the fact that we're part of this international approach saying there will be no impunity for any war crimes in Ukraine is very important, and it will affect the morale of those conscripts, because they will have to be thinking when they get illegal orders which would be breaches of international humanitarian law, do they actually carry those out and risk ending up in prison?
Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It is just after 9:10, and you're watching a special ITV News programme on the war in Ukraine. These are the latest developments so far today. Some breaking news this morning which could offer a safe route out for hundreds of thousands of civilians. A new temporary ceasefire has been announced in the southern city of Mariupol. A ceasefire yesterday only lasted minutes, though, before the attacks began. It's thought 400,000 people remain in the city. The ceasefire is in place from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. local time. The evacuations are due to start 1 hour from now. Well, overnight, cities and towns continued to be attacked. The town of Irpin, north of the capital, the focus of intense fighting. And in response to the growing humanitarian crisis, £85 million has been raised for the DEC charity appeal. It's described as an incredible show of support from the UK public. Well, for many Ukrainians, there's been a sense of frustration and even anger at the UK government. Olia Hercules was born in Kakhovka and is a renowned chef, food writer and now activist who lives in the UK. Yesterday, she delivered a petition to Downing Street pleading for more action, and I'm pleased to say she joins me now. Olia, thank you very much for joining us today. What more do you want the UK government to do?
Just to very quickly explain how my day started. I started it with recording a video for my brother saying goodbye. My brother is in Kiev. He's a pacifist and a civilian, but he joined the regional territorial forces. And they have rifles, but nothing else. No helmets, no protection, nothing. So support for civilians who are fighting would be incredible. But my family my parents are in Kakhovka at the moment in my hometown, and they're under siege. Kherson is under Russian control. And, you know, so my family are there. They're not coming to the UK. However, I have so many friends who are asking how they can get their family in. And I just wanted to say that the UK has to match the European 3-year waiver of all visas to all Ukrainians, because the Ukraine family scheme is a complete mess. It doesn't work. And it needs to be scrapped, and all Ukrainians need to be let in. The stuff that they're going through right now, again, messages from friends today. Olia, my family and with small kids are in Kharkiv. Do you know of safe routes to get them out of there? What do I tell them?
I don't know if you heard the Deputy Prime Minister just before we spoke to you talking about the UK's response to Ukrainian refugees, and it doesn't sound like there is going to be any change in that plan. How do you respond to that, especially having delivered that petition to Downing Street?
The Ukrainian family scheme just doesn't work. If we're going to stick with it, at least people on the phone, I know that they're working flat out and they're getting so many calls. I understand, but they need to be trained on how to speak to people who are dealing with trauma every single day. They can't just say, oh, how long are they coming for? It's not a holiday, you know? Another thing that completely doesn't work and is extremely confusing. So, for example, as far as I understand, a niece can invite an aunt from Ukraine to come into the UK, but not the other way around. So I'm, as a British citizen and an aunt, I can't get my niece, who is now in a bomb shelter in Lviv, to come here. It doesn't work. It needs to be, it needs to be fixed. It needs to be looked over, and changes have to be made. But really, I think that it's just going to take so much energy and time. I really insist, and I will be campaigning for a complete waiver of visas to all Ukrainians.
You must feel very far away from your family right now. It's just across the water on the continent, and yet, given the situation that you're in with both your brother and your parents.
Yeah, especially yesterday, I felt like that when I lost I lost touch with my parents for 24/7, and that was the most hellish 24/7 of my life. Because in Kherson, they're under Russian control now, and they're trying to sever all communications. So yeah, sometimes I do feel very far away from them, but I also have never felt as close to them as I do some days, because all of the families, all of the, and not just Ukrainian people, also the British public have been absolutely fantastic. And there's this huge network of people trying to help each other and trying to help families and friends that are in Ukraine. And, I'm just in such an awe of the British public, but the British government has to match their people right now.
Have you been able to establish contact with your parents since losing that contact with them?
Yeah, my mom managed to call me last night, and she said that they're working on different ways to find ways to connect with me. And you know what? They've been so stoic. They've been so brave, because they don't want me to panic. They want me to, to be okay and to keep doing what I'm doing. But yesterday she was crying because she was stressed out that I'd be stressed out that we lost touch for 24/7, They're incredible. Their stoicism and their bravery and their kind of energy is just unimaginable.
How are they coping with what your brother is facing?
Well, before we lost touch with my mom, at the start we used to have really long conversations, video conversations, and then the calls became shorter and shorter. And I know that's because my mom doesn't want me to see her cry. So, what is there to say?
Yeah. Olia Hercules, I'm sure your fight will continue to get more support for any and all Ukrainian refugees who want to come to the UK. It's a shame I couldn't put some of your points to the Deputy Prime Minister, but that's the way the order of the interviews happened this morning. I'm sure we'll have time to put your points to another government minister at some point as the conflict continues. Olia Hercules, thank you very much for your thoughts and for your insights into what your family is going through right now. Thank you.
You're fantastic, Nina. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Let's go back to our correspondent Romy Weeks now, who is currently in Lviv in western Ukraine. She is at the city's main railway station, and I'm guessing we left you about an hour ago, but I'm guessing you are witnessing the same scenes you did before, with just so very many people trying to leave Lviv and escape Ukraine.
Nina, it is really quite extraordinary. I've been to the Polish side of the border, I've been to the Ukrainian side of the border, I've been to reception centres. I have seen nothing on the scale of what we are seeing here in Lviv at the main train station. Thousands upon thousands of people, just as far as the eye can see, both arriving and trying to leave. Behind me here is the queue. This is the queue for trains. For people who are trying to head to Poland. It hasn't moved much in the time that we have been here. It is an enormous crush. If we look over here, these are people who are arriving from other areas like Kiev, Kharkiv and Mariupol, where there is more fighting. They are trying to take buses, they are trying to take trams, they're trying to take trains. Some people are being taken to reception centres here where they can at least get warm and get something to drink and maybe sleep. It is very cold here, as you can see. People are arriving with their children all bundled up, with their dogs, with their pets. Ukraine is an enormous country. People have been travelling very long distances, 12, 24 hours on buses and on trains. They're arriving here, you see everybody's on their mobile phones trying to work out what to do next, because this isn't the end of the journey. This, for many people, is only a staging post midway through their journey. I want to talk to some of the people in the queue here. This is, hello. This is Nastya and her sister Tasha, who have come from Dnipro. Tell me a little bit about your journey, how it's been getting here.
Наша дорога была очень тяжелая, длинная. В принципе, мы очень замерзли, но, думаю, это того стоило.
And now you're trying to go to Poland?
Yeah, we go to Poland in Przemysl. Yeah, in Przemysl with my mommy, my sister, dog.
And you brought your little dog with you?
Yeah. Yoda.
And how difficult has the journey been so far?
Как много чего? Это было очень тяжело, потому что 17 часов никто не спал, и это тяжело физически.
The road is difficult, 17 hours with no sleep, and it's just difficult.
And how do you all feel about leaving your country?
Что я могу сказать о моей стране?
Leaving your country.
Уезд из вашей страны.
Это тяжело. Очень.
It's very difficult, I know, and I wish you luck, and I hope you get to where you're going. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
That's Nastya and Tasha who are heading to Poland, and they told me that they've been crying for 3 days as they try to leave and try to get to where they're going. It is so many difficult stories here, so many people who are completely confused, who really don't know where this journey ends, what they're going to do next. And what you're hearing over and over and over again is, we would just like to be able to go home.
Just such a simple request, and so very difficult at this current time in cities across Ukraine. Romy Weeks for now. Thank you very much. Let's go back to our US correspondent, Emma Murphy, who, as you can see, is standing by in Washington. Emma, huge pressure on America to do more to help Ukraine right now.
Indeed, and the more that we hear from Ukrainians who are trying to get away, as we just heard there from Romy, the more that pressure builds. And it's kind of a balance for them. How do they deal with this? How much do they offer lethal protective support to Ukraine? How much do they offer humanitarian aid? What's interesting is that there is a huge degree of support across the parties here. I was listening to one of the armed forces committees the other day, and one of the representatives there said, "Tell us what you want, tell us what you need, and we will do what we can. You are pushing on an open door." And that was to somebody from the State Department. So there's no doubt that there is a great wish to try and help here. The First Lady actually was in San Francisco last night, and she was talking about the situation. She deviated from the speech that she was planning on giving to say that, "I suppose I ought to talk to you about what's on everybody's minds, and that is this war and where it goes." And she said that she wakes every morning anxious to know whether or not President Zelensky is alive and what has happened to people in Ukraine overnight. She also said that her husband was fielding calls day and night trying to deal with this, and that they wanted to do the right thing by the Ukrainian people. Where they go with the right thing, though, is so tricky, and one of the negotiations that we understand is now going on is between the White House and Poland, and of course Secretary of State Blinken was there yesterday, and this is over the issue of fighter jets to try and get round this problem that they have with the no-fly zone. We understand that there will be more talks during the course of today about trying to get those jets from Poland in order to be able to fly in Ukraine and then backfill the Polish position with American F-16s. Also today, we expect to get more indication from the United Nations. They will be meeting again in emergency session tomorrow. They seem to have been in permanent emergency session for the last 2 weeks. There is an attempt to put a resolution together condemning what has gone on and urging the path to diplomacy. But of course, there is that power of veto that's held by Russia, and without question, Russia will use that power of veto. The one thing that I get when I speak to permanent representatives from the UN is a real feeling that they know that they are very, very powerless in many ways because of the power of veto. But what they want to do is try and explain and highlight to Russia, as if it didn't already know, just how isolated they are on the global stage, and try and use that isolation to force the diplomats to the table to try and bring some form of de-escalation on the situation on the ground in Ukraine.
And Emma, briefly just bring us up to speed. The USA now urging its citizens to leave Russia.
Yes, they've been saying for weeks now that they would advise people to leave, but yesterday they issued a warning to leave immediately. There is obviously great concern about the safety of individual Americans in the country, and the message to evacuate, to leave, came with a warning that there would be no way that there would be any American assistance, direct assistance to get people out if they got stuck in there as the mood towards Americans deteriorates.
Emma Murphy, thank you very much. Let's rejoin our Europe editor, James Mates, in the capital, Kiev. Let's focus on Mariupol, though, actually, James. This time, will the ceasefire that's been announced this morning be respected? Will it hold? Will people be able to leave without fear of attack or coming under attack?
Absolutely no way of knowing. We thought, well, we were optimistic yesterday, and it turned out absolutely not to be the case. And that has been the pattern in the past in other conflicts that have involved the Russians, humanitarian corridors being set up and then not being observed. What we have just heard from the officers of the Halo Trust, who are the charity who work a lot on landmine clearances and other issues in conflict zones, they last had contact with their staff in Mariupol at about 5 o'clock yesterday evening. The last message was no communication, no water, no electricity, no food in stores. Ships, artillery and planes are shooting. The population is already on the edge, but we're holding on. This is a living hell. So that gives you an idea what it's like for the 400,000 people in Mariupol. It has the makings of a massive humanitarian disaster if these corridors don't work.
And the point is that people listening to this in this country have no idea what that is like, but we have seen these sieges take place in other conflicts in other countries, and it's absolutely desperate times, isn't it? People are trapped without supplies and without an escape route.
No, we've seen it far too often. We've seen it in Sarajevo, we've seen it in Grozny in Chechnya, and of course much more recently we've seen it in Aleppo and in Homs and in other cities in Syria. Aleppo in particular, which came under Russian bombardment. That was the siege that happened after the Russians got involved on Assad's side there. So, excuse me, we know the humanitarian horrors that await in these situations, and for it to happen to a city like Mariupol would be truly devastating.
James, we'll let you go. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for this special programme to just bring our viewers the very latest developments this weekend on the situation after the invasion of Ukraine by President Putin's forces 11 days ago, and all the things that follow in terms of the unfolding scenes that we're seeing of people trying to escape Ukraine, and also those trapped in those cities where there is now this siege surrounding those people. Before we go for more analysis of the latest from Ukraine, do have a listen to our latest ITV News podcast, What You Need to Know. Our correspondent Robert Moore, who has been with me in the studio this morning, joins Tom Bradby in the latest episode, How Far Will Putin Go? It is available wherever you get your podcasts from. Well, that brings us to the end of our special ITV News programme this morning on the invasion of Ukraine. We'll have the latest from there on our lunchtime update. That's at 1:30. Until then, from all of us here, thanks for joining us. And whatever you're doing, please do have a lovely morning. Bye-bye.